May 28, 1940. The morning sun barely penetrates the smoke-stained windows of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. Inside this imposing building, symbol of German military might, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring sits at his ornate desk, the very picture of confident power. His uniform, festooned with medals earned and imagined, reflects the overhead lights as he reaches for a document that has just arrived from the intelligence division. The pages contain translations of recent American pronouncements, statements from across the Atlantic that have filtered through diplomatic channels and newspaper reports. Göring begins to read, and within moments, a smile creases his face. Not a smile of pleasure, but one of undisguised contempt. The document details President Franklin Roosevelt's recent request to the United States Congress, an unprecedented expansion of American aircraft production, a capacity, Roosevelt has declared, to manufacture 50,000 planes annually. 50,000. The number seems absurd to Göring, who commands the most powerful air force in the world, the Luftwaffe, which has just helped crush Poland and is at this very moment supporting the armored thrust through France that is bringing the French Third Republic to its knees. Göring sets the document down and turns to his assembled staff officers, men who have overseen the construction of Germany's aerial war machine. "The Americans are desperate if they believe such propaganda will frighten us," Göring announces, his voice dripping with derision. "They know nothing of war production. Let them try to convert their automobile factories. They will learn that building warplanes requires more than assembly lines." The officers nod in agreement. After all, they have seen what German industry can accomplish under the direction of the National Socialist state. They have witnessed the expansion of Messerschmitt and Junkers production facilities. They understand that aircraft manufacturing demands precision engineering, specialized materials, and skilled labor cultivated over years. The idea that Americans, with their commercial mindset and their democracy's inherent inefficiencies, could match German capabilities seems laughable. But while Göring and his staff share their contemptuous amusement in Berlin, something profound is already beginning in America. In Detroit, Michigan, a city synonymous with automotive innovation, a Danish immigrant named William Knudsen is about to prove every assumption Göring holds to be catastrophically wrong. This is a history documentary about the most dramatic industrial transformation in human history, a World War II story that would determine the fate of nations not through battlefield heroics alone, but through the revolutionary power of democratic production. This is the untold story of how American factories became the decisive weapon of the Second World War, and how one man's contempt for democratic capability became the epitome of strategic blindness. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable chapter of WW II history, if you're fascinated by these untold stories of World War II and want to explore more military history and war documentary content, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. I'd also love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city in the comments below. Now let's return to May 1940 and understand exactly what Roosevelt was proposing and why it seemed so impossible. The proclamation that triggered Hermann Göring's contempt came on May 16, 1940, a date that would prove far more significant than anyone in Berlin could imagine. Standing before a joint session of Congress, with the catastrophic news from Europe dominating every headline, Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered one of the most audacious statements in American political history. German panzers were at that very moment racing through France, having bypassed the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line. Belgium had fallen, the Netherlands had surrendered. The British Expeditionary Force was being pushed toward the Channel coast, facing potential annihilation. The military situation in Europe looked dire, and America, officially neutral but increasingly alarmed, appeared woefully unprepared for the global conflagration that seemed inevitable. Roosevelt understood the mathematics of modern warfare better than most. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, and he had watched with growing concern as the totalitarian powers rearmed throughout the 1930s, while America remained deliberately isolated from European affairs. Now facing Congress, he spoke with unusual directness. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year," he declared. The reaction in the chamber was mixed. uncertainty and skepticism evident on many faces. The reaction across the nation ranged from supportive to openly doubtful. The reaction in Germany was, as we have seen, contemptuous dismissal. And the skepticism was understandable when one examined the actual state of American military aviation in 1939. That year, American factories had produced just 3,611 military aircraft. Not 50,000, not even 5,000. Barely more than 3,000. The Army Air Corps, the branch that would eventually become the United States Air Force, possessed approximately 1,700 combat planes, and many of those were obsolete designs that would be utterly ineffective against modern German fighters. The P-40 Warhawk was just entering production. The P-38 Lightning existed only as prototypes. The legendary P-51 Mustang had not even been conceived. America's bomber force consisted largely of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-18 Bolos, with production numbers that could be counted in dozens per month, not hundreds. Roosevelt was asking for a 14-fold increase in production. To put this in perspective, imagine a factory producing 10 cars per day being asked to produce 140 cars per day within a few years, while simultaneously developing entirely new car models, training thousands of new workers, building new factory buildings, and coordinating with hundreds of suppliers who were also undergoing massive expansion. The challenge was not merely ambitious, it was, by any rational assessment, impossible. Or so it seemed to everyone except a small group of men who understood both American industrial capacity and the unique character of American manufacturing. Chief among these men was William Cygnus Knudsen, and his story embodies the American immigrant experience in its most triumphant form. Born in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1879, Knudsen had arrived in America as a young man with little money but tremendous mechanical aptitude. He had worked his way up through the automotive industry, eventually catching the attention of Henry Ford himself. At Ford Motor Company, Knudsen had helped implement the revolutionary assembly line techniques that made the Model T affordable for ordinary Americans. But Knudsen's relationship with the autocratic Henry Ford eventually soured, as it did for many talented Ford executives, and in 1921 Knudsen moved to General Motors. At GM, William Knudsen found his true calling. He rose through the ranks to become president of the corporation, overseeing its growth into the world's largest automobile manufacturer. Knudsen understood mass production at a level few others could match. He knew how to break complex assemblies into manageable sub-assemblies. He understood supply chain logistics. He knew how to train workers quickly and efficiently. He comprehended the relationship between design, tooling, and production speed. When war clouds gathered over Europe, Knudsen was earning a salary of $300,000 annually, an enormous sum in 1939 dollars, equivalent to well over $5 million in today's currency. He lived comfortably, respected and successful, and then Franklin Roosevelt called. The president needed someone who could achieve the impossible, someone who could transform American industry from peacetime production to wartime mobilization. Presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, himself a veteran of industrial mobilization during World War I, gave Roosevelt his assessment when asked who could possibly manage such a massive undertaking. First, Bill Knudsen, Baruch said. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. There was simply no one else with Knudsen's combination of technical knowledge, organizational ability, and practical experience managing vast industrial operations. In May 1940, William Knudsen accepted Roosevelt's offer to serve as a $1-a-year man, the term given to business executives who worked for the government for a nominal salary of $1 per year. Knudsen abandoned his $300,000 salary to serve his adopted nation. This was not merely patriotic symbolism. Knudsen genuinely believed in American democracy, and he could see what was happening in Europe with clear eyes. The totalitarian powers had to be stopped, and America's contribution would not come primarily through military prowess, at least not initially, but through industrial might. Knudsen understood that factories could be as decisive as armies, and he was determined to prove it. The transformation began immediately, though it would take time for the results to become visible. Knudsen brought automotive mass production principles to aircraft manufacturing. A field that had traditionally operated more like a craft industry than mass production, aircraft had been built almost one at a time by skilled craftsmen. Each plane was essentially custom-made, with parts fitted individually. This produced excellent aircraft, but slowly and expensively. Knudsen saw that this approach could never meet Roosevelt's goal. Instead, he envisioned aircraft production organized like automobile production, with standardized parts, specialized workstations, and moving assembly lines. The skeptics were numerous and vocal. Aircraft manufacturers insisted that planes were too complex for true mass production. Engineers argued that the precision required for aircraft components exceeded automotive tolerances. Military officers worried that mass production would sacrifice quality for quantity. Labor unions questioned whether their members could be trained quickly enough. Business leaders wondered whether converting automotive factories to aircraft production was even possible. And through it all, William Knudsen remained unshakably confident. He had seen American industry accomplish seemingly impossible feats before. He knew what American workers could achieve when properly organized and motivated. By December 1941, just months before America would be thrust into the war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, American factories were already producing 2,000 military aircraft monthly. This represented a 20-fold increase from just 2 years earlier. The Ford Motor Company announced plans for a massive bomber plant at Willow Run, Michigan. Boeing expanded its Seattle facilities dramatically. Douglas Aircraft in California began hiring thousands of workers and constructing new factory buildings. North American Aviation ramped up production of the T-6 Texan trainer and began design work on a new fighter that would become the legendary P-51 Mustang. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt termed it, was awakening from its long peacetime slumber. But the achievement of American industrial mobilization cannot be understood solely through production statistics and factory expansions, significant though those were. To truly comprehend what happened between 1940 and 1945, we must understand the ideological blindness that prevented Germany from correctly assessing American capability. The Nazi leadership's dismissal of American productive capacity stemmed from both racial prejudice and willful blindness, two characteristics that would prove fatal to the Third Reich's ambitions. This was not mere underestimation. It was a systematic failure to perceive reality, driven by an ideology that prized racial mythology over empirical evidence. Consider the case of General Friedrich von Boertke, the German military attaché stationed in Washington from 1933 to 1941. Von Boertke was an experienced intelligence officer who understood his assignment. He was to observe American military and industrial developments and report accurately to Berlin. And report he did, sending cable after cable describing the massive expansion of American industry, the mobilization of resources, the training of workers, the construction of new factories. His December 1940 cable warned with stark clarity that American war production would reach unimaginable heights. He provided specific details about aircraft production plans, about the conversion of automotive factories, about the training programs being implemented. Berlin's response to these accurate intelligence reports was dismissive rejection. The cables were characterized as defeatist exaggeration. Von Boertke was suspected of having been compromised by American propaganda. His reports were filed away, essentially ignored by decision-makers who preferred ideologically comfortable fantasies to uncomfortable realities. This was not unusual in the Nazi system, where ideology trumped intelligence with depressing regularity. Officers who reported unwelcome facts risked being labeled defeatist or unreliable. Those who confirmed existing prejudices were praised and promoted. The incentive structure virtually guaranteed strategic blindness. When von Boertke met personally with Adolf Hitler in February 1939 before the war began to discuss American industrial potential, the encounter revealed the depth of Nazi delusion. Instead of listening to his experienced military attaché's assessment, Hitler launched into a lengthy rant about American racial degeneracy. Americans, the Führer proclaimed, were half Judaized and half negrified, incapable of the sustained effort required for modern warfare. Their democracy made them weak and indecisive. Their diverse population could never achieve the unity of purpose that National Socialism had forged in Germany. Their obsession with commercial profit meant they understood business, but not war. Their comfortable lifestyle had made them soft and unwilling to make sacrifices. Every single one of these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong, but they were repeated so often within Nazi circles that they became accepted truth. The prejudice permeated all levels of German military and political leadership. Luftwaffe intelligence officers dismissed reports of women entering aircraft factories as signs of American desperation, unable to conceive that democratic mobilization might actually exceed totalitarian command in effectiveness. When reports arrived describing factories operating 3 shifts around the clock, German analysts assumed exaggeration or propaganda. When intelligence indicated that American aircraft designs were rapidly improving based on combat feedback, German officials attributed this to captured German technology rather than American innovation. The Nazi worldview simply could not accommodate American reality. Totalitarian systems, for all their supposed efficiency, suffer from a crippling weakness. They cannot tolerate information that contradicts official ideology. In democratic systems, bad news gets reported, debated, and acted upon because no single authority can suppress unwelcome facts. In totalitarian systems, bad news gets suppressed, distorted, or ignored because reporting it can be dangerous to one's career or even life. Germany would pay dearly for this systematic self-deception, but the price would not become fully apparent until American aircraft began appearing over German cities in numbers that made mockery of every pre-war assumption. As 1941 progressed and America drew closer to formal entry into the war, the expansion of American aircraft production accelerated. But one facility would come to symbolize both the ambition and the challenges of this unprecedented industrial transformation. The Willow Run plant, constructed by Ford Motor Company on farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan, would become legendary, though its path to success would be far more difficult than early enthusiasts imagined. Construction began on April 18, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor would bring America fully into the conflict. The vision was audacious: create the world's largest factory under one roof, a facility so vast that it would dwarf anything previously attempted. The completed Willow Run plant covered 3.5 million square feet. To put this in perspective, that's equivalent to about 65 football fields under one roof. The assembly line stretched 1 mile, more than 5,000 feet. Workers would joke that you needed a bicycle to get from one end of the factory to the other in reasonable time. The scale was simply unprecedented in industrial history. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief and one of the automotive industry's most capable manufacturing executives, promised to build 1 B-24 Liberator bomber per hour when fully operational, a rate that seemed absurd when other aircraft factories were managing 1 bomber per day, if that. The B-24 Liberator was a complex machine, one of the most sophisticated aircraft of its era. It featured 4 engines, each capable of 1,200 horsepower. Its wingspan exceeded 110 feet. It carried a crew of 10 men. It was armed with 10 50 caliber machine guns in various turret positions. Its bomb bay could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs. The aircraft consisted of 488,193 individual parts. Each part had to be manufactured to precise tolerances, then assembled in correct sequence, then tested to ensure proper function. The idea of producing one such aircraft every hour seemed to violate basic principles of manufacturing. Initial results were, to put it mildly, catastrophic. The first B-24 rolled out of Willow Run in September 1942, and it required complete rebuilding before it could be accepted by the military. Quality control failures reached 50%, meaning half the components failed inspection. Parts didn't fit properly, assemblies were misaligned, electrical systems malfunctioned, hydraulic lines leaked. The aircraft that were completed took far longer than planned and required extensive rework. By February 1943, Willow Run was producing just 56 bombers monthly against promises of hundreds. The plant had become a national embarrassment. Newspaper columnists dubbed it "Will It Run?" mocking Ford's failure to deliver on its promises. Critics had abundant ammunition. The factory was too large, making coordination difficult. The workforce was inexperienced, many having never worked in manufacturing before. The training programs were inadequate. The supply chain was chaotic, with parts shortages causing constant delays. The B-24 design itself kept changing as combat experience revealed necessary modifications, and each design change rippled through the production system, causing disruptions. Congressional committees investigated. Military officials expressed frustration. Ford's reputation was on the line, and by extension, the reputation of American mass production itself. If Willow Run failed, it would validate Nazi assumptions about American industrial incompetence. But Ford's engineers, drawing on decades of automotive manufacturing experience, refused to give up. They broke the B-24's 488,000 parts into manageable sub-assemblies, organizing production so that each subassembly could be manufactured, inspected, and tested before final assembly. They developed specialized hydraulic riveting tools that allowed workers to drive rivets faster and more accurately than manual methods. They created prefabricated wiring harnesses so that complex electrical systems could be installed as complete units rather than wired individually. They implemented moving assembly lines, borrowing directly from automotive practice, so that the aircraft moved through the factory rather than remaining stationary while workers moved to it. They designed custom tooling and fixtures that allowed less skilled workers to perform complex tasks accurately. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to accommodate design changes without stopping production. The B-24 underwent 578 design changes in 1943 alone, an average of more than one per day. Each change had to be incorporated into production without halting the assembly line. Ford developed a system where changes were batched and implemented at planned intervals so that modifications could be made to tooling and work instructions in an organized manner. This required extraordinary coordination between Ford engineers, military liaisons, and the original aircraft designer, Consolidated Aircraft Corporation. The system they developed would become standard practice for managing complex production programs. Gradually, month by month, production increased. By September 1943, monthly production reached 148 bombers, nearly triple the February figure. By December, production hit 365 aircraft, meaning more than one per day. But the real breakthrough came in April 1944, when Willow Run produced 428 B-24s, achieving the target of one complete bomber every 63 minutes, operating 24 hours daily. At this rate, this single factory was producing more aircraft than Germany's entire aviation industry. Let that sink in for a moment. One American factory, located on former farmland in Michigan, outproduced an entire nation's aircraft industry. This was not a minor achievement. This was a revolutionary transformation in the nature of industrial warfare. The workers who accomplished this miracle came from astonishingly diverse backgrounds. Many had been farmers before the war. Others had worked in automotive factories and brought valuable experience. Women, who comprised less than 1% of aircraft workers in 1941, represented 65% of Willow Run's workforce by 1943. Young people fresh out of high school worked alongside retirees who had come out of retirement to support the war effort. African Americans from the rural South migrated north in massive numbers, seeking both economic opportunity and a chance to contribute to defeating fascism. Mexican Americans from southwestern states brought agricultural skills that translated surprisingly well to factory work. The workforce was a cross-section of American diversity, united by common purpose. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Precision improved, quality improved, production speed improved. Women excelled particularly at detailed work like wiring, instrument installation, and quality inspection. Their integration represented democratic strength, not weakness, but this reality was invisible to German observers, whose ideology prevented them from seeing what was directly in front of them. The Nazi worldview held that women belonged in the home, that their role was to bear children for the Reich, not to work in factories. This ideological blindness cost Germany access to half its potential workforce, while America mobilized its entire population effectively. As American production soared beyond imagination, and German defenses crumbled under the weight of accumulated aircraft, the Nazi leadership retreated into fantasy. In February 1944, Hermann Göring authorized the Jägerstab program, a desperate attempt to disperse aircraft production into 729 underground facilities using slave labor. The program was born of desperation and maintained through brutality. The Mittelbau-Dora complex, the largest of these underground factories, employed 60,000 prisoners in conditions that defied human decency. 20,000 died from overwork, starvation, disease, and deliberate murder. These underground factories, built at enormous cost in resources and human lives, proved counterproductive. Slave laborers, facing certain death regardless of their actions, sabotaged components whenever possible. Subtle sabotage that would not be detected immediately, but would cause failures in operation. Critical bolts left loose, electrical connections deliberately miswired, fuel lines not properly sealed. Transportation between dispersed facilities caused constant delays as components traveled by increasingly disrupted rail networks. Quality control collapsed because inspectors, themselves often prisoners, had no incentive to maintain standards. The entire Mittelbau-Dora complex, with its 60,000 workers and massive investment, produced fewer engines monthly than Ford's single Chicago plant. This was the result of totalitarian production methods. Brutality produced inefficiency, slavery produced sabotage, tyranny produced failure. Meanwhile, American innovation continued accelerating. Boeing developed modular B-29 Superfortress construction across 4 facilities with completely interchangeable parts, meaning components built in Kansas fit perfectly with components built in Washington state. The pressurized B-29, costing $65,000 each, incorporated technology Germany couldn't match even in prototypes. This was the most advanced bomber in the world, capable of flying higher, faster, and farther than any previous aircraft. Its pressurized cabin allowed the crew to operate in comfort at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled. Its remote-controlled gun turrets were marvels of engineering. Its bomb load exceeded anything in any Air Force's inventory. By early 1945, America was producing 100 B-29s monthly. These aircraft would devastate Japanese cities and would deliver the atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War. But even setting aside their ultimate role, they represented a level of technological sophistication and production capability that no other nation could match. Germany had nothing comparable. Japan had nothing comparable. These aircraft were flying demonstrations of American industrial superiority, each one a complex machine that required 2 years of engineering development and massive production investment. Part 2 of this compelling World War II history picks up at a crucial moment, as the accumulated weight of American industrial production begins manifesting in the skies over Europe with undeniable force. The D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, would demonstrate the full culmination of American productive power. The invasion of Normandy was the largest amphibious operation in military history, a precisely coordinated assault involving hundreds of thousands of troops crossing the English Channel to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied France. But the operation's success depended fundamentally on one factor above all others: air superiority. Without control of the skies over the invasion beaches, the landing forces would have been slaughtered. The numbers tell an unequivocal story. The Allied forces deployed 11,590 aircraft to support the invasion, fighters to protect the beaches, fighter bombers to attack German positions, medium bombers to destroy transportation networks, heavy bombers to devastate German defenses, transport aircraft to deliver paratroopers, reconnaissance aircraft to monitor enemy movements. The Luftwaffe, Germany's once mighty air force that had terrorized Europe in the early war years, managed 319 sorties on D-Day. 319 sorties against 11,590 aircraft. This represented a 36-to-1 superiority. Not a tactical advantage, but absolute dominance so complete that German ground forces operated without air support, while Allied forces enjoyed overwhelming air support for every operation. This was not the result of German incompetence or Allied tactical brilliance. This was industrial annihilation made manifest. Between January and May of 1944, in the months leading up to the invasion, Allied preparatory bombing dropped 145,000 tons of explosives on German targets. To provide perspective, this tonnage exceeded all German bombing of Britain throughout the entire war. The Germans had spent years bombing British cities during the Blitz, causing tremendous suffering and destruction. Yet American and British bombers, in just 5 months of concentrated effort, dropped more explosives on German targets than Germany had dropped on Britain in years of sustained attack. The transport aircraft component of the invasion demonstrated American production capacity with particular clarity. 3 entire airborne divisions, comprising tens of thousands of paratroopers and their equipment, were delivered in one day using more planes than Germany's entire transport fleet ever possessed. Germany, which had pioneered airborne operations with successful drops in Norway and Crete early in the war, no longer had sufficient transport aircraft to move even a single division by air. America, which had barely possessed transport aircraft in 1940, now deployed them by the hundreds. The contrast embodied the production war's outcome, the complete reversal of relative capability. By December 1944, as winter settled over Europe and Germany launched its final desperate offensive in the Ardennes, single American bombing raids routinely involved 1,200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. Imagine standing on the ground and watching this armada pass overhead. The bombers alone would take hours to pass, wave after wave. The sound of their engines a continuous thunder that drowned out all other noise. The fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs primarily, possessed sufficient range to reach targets anywhere in German-controlled territory, performance to match any German fighter, and existed in quantities that made losses tactically irrelevant. German pilots had taken to calling them Indians, as in the American West's indigenous peoples, because they seemed to swarm everywhere simultaneously. You could shoot down several and find yourself immediately engaged by several more. Major Günther Röll, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 confirmed victories, described the situation in late 1944 with resignation. "We could win individual dogfights," he wrote. "German pilots were still generally better trained and more experienced than average American pilots. Our aircraft, the later models like the Focke-Wulf 190D, were competitive with American fighters in performance, but we were drowning in their numbers. For every German fighter that took off, 5 American fighters were in the air. For every German fighter lost, no replacement was coming. For every American fighter lost, 2 replacements were already built. The mathematics made victory impossible. We were fighting an industrial colossus with a cottage industry. As defeat became inevitable, even the most devoted Nazi leaders privately acknowledged the production catastrophe that had befallen Germany. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who had spent years telling Germans that victory was assured, wrote in his diary in December 1944 with uncharacteristic honesty, "Göring's promises about Luftwaffe superiority now seem like criminal delusions. We are fighting the world's greatest industrial power with rhetoric and willpower. Willpower cannot shoot down bombers. Determination cannot produce aircraft from thin air. The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every one we destroy and still overwhelm us. When they come, and they are coming, they will come with such material superiority that no position can hold." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most celebrated general, told his staff before D-Day with brutal clarity, "The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every one we destroy and still overwhelm us. When they land, and they will land, they will come with such material superiority that no defensive position can hold." Rommel understood that tactics, which he excelled at, mattered little when facing such overwhelming material advantage. You cannot outmaneuver an enemy who has 10 times your resources. You cannot hold a position when the enemy can bring 10 times more artillery to bear than you possess. The Desert Fox, who had won brilliant victories through tactical genius, now faced an enemy where genius was irrelevant because the material disparity was too great. Even Adolf Hitler himself, who had dismissed American capabilities for years, who had proclaimed American racial inferiority, who had refused to listen to accurate intelligence assessments, admitted to Albert Speer in January 1945, "We should have listened to Beutischer's reports. Their industrial potential was decisive. While we built hundreds of aircraft, they built tens of thousands. Speer later testified at the Nuremberg trials that American bombing had reduced German production by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, and 42% for trucks. He stated unequivocally the American attacks, which followed a definite systematic assault on industrial targets, caused the progressive breakdown of German armaments production. But even as Germany collapsed under the weight of American conventional production, German engineers achieved a genuine technological breakthrough that Hitler and Göring believed could restore German air superiority despite numerical inferiority. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, entered service in mid-1944. This revolutionary aircraft was 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. Its four 30mm cannons could destroy a bomber with a short burst. Its sleek design represented a quantum leap in aerodynamics. Hitler and Göring believed this wonder weapon could compensate for Germany's production deficit. Quality over quantity. Technology over numbers. But even here, the production war's realities intervened decisively. Germany produced just 1,430 Me-262s total throughout the war, with never more than 200 operational simultaneously. The jet engines, made from inferior materials because Germany lacked sufficient chromium and nickel for proper alloys, required complete overhaul every 10 flight hours. Critical materials were simply unavailable, forcing engineers to make substitutions that compromised performance and reliability. The aircraft, magnificent on paper, was unreliable in practice. Training pilots to fly jets took longer than training them for conventional aircraft, and Germany no longer had time or fuel for extended training. America, meanwhile, had begun jet development in 1942, after British scientists shared information about Frank Whittle's jet engine research. The Bell P-59 Aerocomet, America's first jet fighter, proved inferior to German jets and never saw combat. But Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, superior to any German jet in both performance and reliability, entered production before war's end. More significantly, American industrial depth allowed simultaneous pursuit of multiple technologies. America could continue producing P-51 Mustangs by the thousands, while simultaneously developing and preparing to produce P-80 jets. Germany faced agonizing choices, forced to choose between conventional and jet production, because resources were insufficient for both. This contrast epitomized the production war's fundamental dynamic. Germany's technological superiority in jets meant nothing against America's ability to produce thousands of conventional fighters while simultaneously developing next-generation aircraft. Germany had to bet everything on one approach because resources were limited. America could pursue multiple approaches simultaneously because resources were essentially unlimited. Quality without quantity proved worthless in total war. Technological breakthroughs without the industrial base to exploit them were interesting engineering achievements, but strategically irrelevant. The human cost of Germany's production failure manifested in the experiences of German fighter pilots who faced impossible odds daily. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, who survived the war and wrote a compelling memoir, described a mission in March 1945. "I took off knowing I likely would not return," he wrote, "not because American pilots were better, though by this stage many were quite good, but because there were so many of them. I might shoot down 2 or 3 before running out of ammunition or fuel. Then I would be defenseless against the remaining dozens." German fighters by this stage were flying with half-full fuel tanks because petrol was scarce. They were armed with reduced ammunition because factories could not keep pace with consumption. They were maintained by overworked ground crews lacking proper tools and spare parts. American pilots, by contrast, flew aircraft fresh from factories, fully fueled, fully armed, maintained by well-equipped ground crews with abundant spare parts. If their aircraft developed mechanical issues, it was replaced immediately. If they needed more ammunition, supplies were unlimited. If they required fuel, tanker trucks waited at every airfield. The material advantage translated directly into pilot survival. American pilots had better chances because their equipment was better maintained and more readily replaced. German pilots died not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they flew aircraft that were wearing out and could not be replaced. The financial dimensions of the production miracle defied economic orthodoxy and deserve examination because they reveal how democracies can mobilize resources in ways totalitarian states cannot match. Aircraft production consumed $45 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to approximately $800 billion today. The B-29 program alone cost more than the Manhattan Project that developed atomic weapons. These were staggering sums, amounts that should have bankrupted the nation according to conventional economic thinking. Yet, rather than impoverishing America, war production created unprecedented prosperity. Unemployment, which had plagued the Great Depression decade of the 1930s, with rates sometimes exceeding 25%, vanished completely by 1943. Personal income doubled between 1940 and 1945. Workers who had struggled through the Depression years suddenly earned wages they had never imagined. Families who had faced privation could now save money, invest in war bonds, and look forward to post-war prosperity. The economic mobilization proved that massive government spending could stimulate employment and production when resources were being underutilized. War bond sales by workers themselves financed much of the expansion, creating a virtuous cycle where workers essentially funded their own employment. Willow Run workers alone purchased $45 million in bonds, directly funding their factories' operations. Workers bought bonds not just from patriotism, though that mattered, but because they had disposable income for the first time in years, and bonds offered secure savings. The government thus mobilized private savings for public purposes through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. This democratic approach to financing war production stood in stark contrast to Germany's methods. Germany, conversely, consumed 40% of its entire industrial capacity for aircraft production by 1944, yet produced less than half of American output. This represented a devastating indictment of totalitarian economic organization. Germany was trying harder, dedicating a larger share of its economy to aircraft, yet producing dramatically less. The explanation lay in efficiency differences. Democratic organization with voluntary cooperation proved more efficient than totalitarian command with forced labor. Workers who were paid fair wages and worked voluntarily produced more per capita than slaves who were worked to death. Free engineers solved problems faster than engineers operating under ideological constraints. Supply chains based on market coordination worked better than supply chains based on bureaucratic allocation. Slave labor, which Germany relied upon increasingly as German men were drafted into military service, proved catastrophically counterproductive. Sabotage was endemic. Quality collapsed. Productivity per German worker actually declined after 1943, when slave labor became widespread, while American productivity per worker increased 300% through improved methods and tools. The moral bankruptcy of slavery revealed itself as economic bankruptcy as well. Systems built on cruelty and exploitation are inefficient. Systems built on freedom and fair compensation are efficient. This was not idealistic theory. This was empirical reality demonstrated through production statistics. The production infrastructure built for war became the foundation for post-war prosperity, creating benefits that extended decades beyond the war's end. Aluminum smelters built for bombers produced materials for suburban housing construction in the 1950s. Chemical plants that made aviation fuel created plastics for the consumer goods revolution. Machine tool factories that equipped aircraft plants tooled up American industry for global dominance in the post-war decades. The wartime investment in production capacity did not disappear when peace returned. It was repurposed for peacetime production, giving America an industrial base unmatched anywhere in the world. Beyond raw production lay organizational excellence that deserves recognition. The War Production Board, established to coordinate mobilization, managed to coordinate 184,000 companies seamlessly. This was not centralized command in the Soviet sense. American companies remained privately owned and independently managed. but they cooperated voluntarily to meet production goals because contracts were profitable and because the national emergency demanded cooperation. IBM punch-card machines, primitive computers by modern standards but cutting-edge technology for the era, tracked millions of components across thousands of suppliers, ensuring that parts arrived when needed. MIT's radiation laboratory, employing 4,000 scientists, developed navigation systems that gave American bombers all-weather capability. This was genuinely revolutionary. Early in the war, bombing required visual targeting, meaning operations were impossible in clouds or darkness. By mid-war, American bombers could navigate and bomb accurately in any weather using radar-based systems developed at MIT. This technological advantage meant American bombers could operate when German fighters were grounded by weather, a crucial tactical advantage that German technology could not match despite Germany's reputation for engineering excellence. When combat revealed vulnerabilities, American industry responded with extraordinary speed. When early B-17 missions revealed vulnerability to frontal attacks, German fighters having learned to attack from ahead, where the bombers had fewer defensive guns, Boeing added chin turrets within 60 days. 60 days from problem identification to solution implementation. When Pacific operations required extended range to reach Japanese targets across vast ocean distances, Consolidated modified B-24s without stopping production, incorporating additional fuel tanks and other changes while maintaining production schedules. German modifications, by contrast, took months or years because the production system lacked flexibility. Changes required approval from multiple bureaucratic levels. Tooling changes had to be coordinated across dispersed and often underground facilities. Testing took longer because fuel shortages limited flight time. The sclerotic German system could not adapt quickly. American improvements took weeks because the system was designed for flexibility and rapid iteration. This adaptability proved as decisive as production volume. American aircraft evolved continuously based on global combat experience. Information flowed from Pacific battles to Atlantic production lines within days through cable communications and direct military-industry liaison. German aircraft, produced in isolated underground facilities by slave labor who had no connection to combat pilots, remained static while American designs improved weekly. The feedback loop between combat and production achieved unprecedented efficiency. Pilot observations reached engineers immediately through formal debriefing systems. Engineer solutions reached assembly lines within days through established communication channels. Assembly line workers' suggestions reached designers directly through suggestion programs that rewarded innovation. This democratic flow of information, where ideas could come from anywhere in the system, proved superior to German hierarchical command, where information flowed only through official channels and only upward through ranks. Consider the experience of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would eventually command the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In early 1943, Tibbets was testing B-29s and identifying problems. He wrote detailed reports about handling characteristics, about mechanical issues, about what needed improvement. Within weeks, engineers from Boeing were implementing changes based on his observations. Within months, those changes appeared in production aircraft. The cycle from problem identification to solution implementation was measured in weeks, not months or years. This was possible only because the system was designed to be responsive, to value input from users, to iterate rapidly. German pilot reports, when they reached factories at all, often disappeared into bureaucracy. The rigid hierarchy meant that a lieutenant's observations might never reach a designer who could act on them. Even when problems were well known, fixing them required navigating complex approval processes. The system was designed for top-down control, not bottom-up innovation. This structural difference in how information flowed through the respective production systems was as important as any single technological advancement. Democracy's advantage lay partly in its information systems, in the way it enabled rapid adaptation and continuous improvement. As 1945 began, Germany's position had become hopeless, but the Nazi leadership fought on, clinging to fantasies of wonder weapons that would reverse their fortunes. The production war was over, Germany had lost decisively. American factories were producing more military aircraft monthly than Germany had produced in entire years. The quantitative advantage was so overwhelming that no tactical skill could compensate. German pilots, even the aces with hundreds of victories, could only delay the inevitable. They could shoot down American bombers, but more bombers kept coming. They could win individual dogfights, but lost the overall battle through attrition. The final months of the European War saw Germany's Air Force, once the most feared military force in the world, reduced to impotence. Jet fighters that should have been war-winning weapons appeared in numbers too small to matter. Wonder weapons that should have restored Germany's technological edge proved unreliable due to material shortages. Experienced pilots who should have been training the next generation instead died in unequal combats. And over it all, American bombers flew in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, pounding what remained of German industry into rubble, their very presence in the sky proof that the production war had been won decisively. Part 3 of this detailed World War II history documentary examines the final reckoning, the moment when Hermann Göring, architect of Germany's Air Force and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, was forced to confront the reality of American industrial might. Göring's arrest on May 8, 1945, by elements of the United States 36th Infantry Division marked the beginning of his painful education about the true nature of the war he had lost. Initially defiant at the interrogation facility in Augsburg, a city in southern Bavaria, he maintained that German technology had been superior, that German pilots had been braver, that Germany had been overcome only by crude numbers and material superiority, that any nation with America's resources could have achieved. His subsequent transfer to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a dedicated facility for high-ranking Nazi prisoners awaiting trial, brought more intensive interrogation. American intelligence officers, armed with detailed production statistics and combat reports, began systematically dismantling Göring's self-justifying narratives. In July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler, an Army historian and interrogator, conducted extensive interviews with Göring, sessions that were recorded and later analyzed by historians seeking to understand Nazi leadership thinking. These conversations revealed Göring's evolving, reluctant recognition of American industrial superiority. "I knew American industrial potential was great," Göring admitted to Heckler in one session. His voice, according to Heckler's notes, carried less of the bombast he had shown in earlier interrogations. But the execution exceeded my worst fears. That single factory at Willow Run produced more aircraft than our entire bomber force at peak production. It was genuinely incomprehensible to me. We had intelligence reports, yes, but I dismissed them as exaggerated. How could one factory outproduce an entire nation's aviation industry? Yet it did. The numbers don't lie. Göring expressed particular astonishment at American logistics, the mundane but essential work of supplying forces across vast distances. Your ability to supply forces across 2 oceans while simultaneously maintaining domestic production, this was beyond our conception of what was possible. We couldn't adequately supply forces 500 miles from Germany. You supplied armies 5,000 miles from America, across oceans, continuously, without fail. Every soldier had ammunition. Every aircraft had fuel. Every vehicle had spare parts. This systematic capability, this organizational excellence, we had nothing comparable. The interrogations revealed how completely Nazi ideology had blinded German leadership. Göring had genuinely believed that diverse democratic America could not match totalitarian Germany's unity and efficiency. He had believed that women could not perform industrial work effectively. He had believed that American comfort and prosperity made Americans soft and unwilling to sacrifice. Every single assumption had proved spectacularly wrong. American diversity became a strength, providing a vast labor pool with varied skills. Democratic organization proved more efficient than totalitarian command. Women proved capable of any industrial task. Comfortable Americans showed themselves willing to sacrifice when presented with existential threats. During his trial at Nuremberg, prosecutors presented Göring with overwhelming statistical evidence that must have been psychologically devastating. Charts showed America producing more aircraft monthly by 1944 than Germany managed annually. Films of Willow Run's assembly lines played in the courtroom, showing bomber after bomber rolling off the production line, while prosecutors listed German cities destroyed by aircraft from that single facility. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, dozens of cities reduced to rubble by bombs delivered by aircraft built in Michigan. The connection between industrial production and military outcome was made explicit and undeniable. Göring's testimony on March 14, 1946, revealed his continuing struggle to comprehend the scale of American achievement. "I believed the economic and technical potential of the United States to be unusually great, particularly for air power," he stated. "But I never imagined they could increase aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. Such growth seemed physically impossible. Where would they find the workers? Where would they get the raw materials? How could they train people so quickly? Yet they did all of this and more. They didn't just train workers. They made those workers more productive than our experienced craftsmen." How do you explain that? Prison psychologist Gustav Gilbert, who had unprecedented access to the Nazi leaders awaiting trial, documented Göring's obsession with production statistics in his book Nuremberg Diary. Göring repeatedly requested production figures, calculated ratios, compared single American factories to entire German production capacity. He seemed particularly fixated on Willow Run, Gilbert noted, calling it that damned factory that broke our backs. When I showed him that America had produced 812,615 aircraft engines versus Germany's 241,675, he simply stared at the figures in silence for several minutes. The mathematical reality of defeat was undeniable, even to someone as self-delusional as Göring. The scope of the transformation remains staggering, even when viewed from today's perspective, decades after these events. From 3,611 military aircraft in 1940, America produced 295,959 by war's end, 97,810 bombers, 99,465 fighters, 98,684 others, including transports, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, and specialized types. This represented not just quantity, but systemic superiority in every aspect of production, from design to manufacturing to quality control to logistics. 2 million Americans worked in aircraft production at peak employment, and the workforce composition shattered every assumption about industrial labor. Women comprised more than half the workforce in many facilities. African Americans, subject to discrimination in civilian life, found relatively better treatment and significantly better wages in war plants. Mexican Americans from southwestern states brought strong work ethics and proved highly capable. Native Americans contributed both in factories and in military service, with some serving as code talkers, whose languages provided unbreakable encryption. Disabled workers found employment in jobs adapted to their capabilities. Teenagers too young for military service worked in factories. Elderly citizens came out of retirement to contribute. This unprecedented diversity achieved what totalitarian uniformity could not. This democratic mobilization achieved what totalitarian command economy could not produce through coercion. Voluntary cooperation exceeded forced labor's output by every metric. Workers who were paid fairly and treated respectfully produced more than slaves who were worked to death. Engineers who could speak freely about problems solved issues faster than engineers who feared being labeled defeatist for reporting difficulties. Supply chains based on market coordination with profit incentives worked better than supply chains based on bureaucratic allocation with political criteria. Democracy proved superior to dictatorship, not just morally, but practically, measured in aircraft produced per worker, in defect rates, in adaptation speed, in every metric that mattered. The workforce that entered factories in 1941, knowing nothing about aircraft, emerged in 1945 as the world's most skilled aviation workers. They didn't just build planes, though that alone would have been sufficient achievement. They revolutionized manufacturing itself, developing techniques that would shape global industry for decades. Statistical quality control, developed for bomber production to reduce defect rates, became standard industrial practice worldwide. Automation principles pioneered at Willow Run transformed manufacturing in every industry. Just-in-time inventory management, developed to reduce warehouse costs during wartime production, became fundamental to efficient manufacturing. The engineers who designed bomber assembly lines would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. The women who riveted B-24s would raise children who became the scientists, engineers, and astronauts of the space program. The production miracle didn't end with military victory. It launched the American century, establishing the United States as the world's dominant economic and military power, a position it would maintain for decades. The capabilities developed for war production translated seamlessly to peacetime prosperity. On October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring wrote his final letter. In it, he made his most complete admission of the production war's significance, words that stand as testimony to the decisive nature of industrial production in modern warfare. The Americans won through industrial power, not military prowess, he wrote. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. The nation we dismissed as capable only of building consumer goods and commercial products buried the Wehrmacht under aluminum and steel. Every assumption I made about American capabilities proved catastrophically wrong. His last recorded statement to psychologist Gilbert was equally revealing and serves as a fitting epitaph for Germany's strategic failure. We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept, Göring told Gilbert. When it awoke, we were doomed. They didn't just outproduce us, they revolutionized production itself. Every aspect of their system proved superior to ours. Their workers were more productive, their factories were more efficient, their supply chains were more reliable, their adaptation was faster, their innovation was continuous. We had nothing comparable. We couldn't have matched them if we had 10 more years to prepare. The gap was simply too large. Göring committed suicide that night, cheating the hangman by taking a cyanide capsule he had somehow concealed, despite thorough searches. But his final testimony stands as history's verdict on the production war. The Reich Marshal, who had dismissed American capabilities, died, knowing that a single American factory, Willow Run, had exceeded his entire Air Force's lifetime production. The man who had commanded the Luftwaffe at its peak of power when German aircraft dominated European skies, died knowing that American factories had produced more aircraft in 1944 alone than Germany produced throughout the entire war. The humiliation was complete. Military historians, examining the Second World War from the perspective of decades, consider the American production achievement the decisive factor in Allied victory. Without the overwhelming material superiority it provided, the D-Day invasion would have been impossible. The forces required could not have been assembled. The air support needed could not have been provided. The logistics to sustain forces in France could not have been maintained. The bombing campaign that devastated German industry would have been unsustainable, with aircraft losses exceeding production capacity. The Pacific War would have been unwinnable, with insufficient aircraft and ships to project power across the vast distances involved. Richard Overy, the leading historian of the air war and author of definitive works on the bombing campaigns, concluded that the outcome was determined not by fighting spirit, not by tactical brilliance, not by individual heroism, but by the weight of material. The Allies won because they buried their enemies under an avalanche of production. This is not to diminish the courage of soldiers who fought, the skill of pilots who flew, the sacrifices of civilians who endured. But courage and skill and sacrifice mattered within a context determined by industrial capacity. Germany's soldiers were courageous, its pilots were skilled, its civilians sacrificed tremendously, but none of that could overcome the mathematical reality of American production. The numbers support this assessment absolutely. By 1944, America alone was producing more military aircraft than the rest of the world combined, Axis and Allied powers included. Not just more than Germany, not just more than Japan, more than everyone else added together. This wasn't incremental superiority, this was order of magnitude dominance. Germany didn't face defeat, Germany faced obliteration, complete industrial overmatch that made military victory impossible regardless of tactics or strategy or fighting spirit. Yet the production miracle's significance transcended military victory, important though that was. It proved democracy's superiority to dictatorship in practical terms that could be measured and verified. It demonstrated freedom's advantage over tyranny in production statistics that admitted no ambiguity. It showed that voluntary cooperation's strength exceeded forced obedience in metrics that could not be disputed. The workers who achieved this transformation weren't slaves or conscripts, but free citizens united in common purpose, working for fair wages, living in their own homes, raising their families, contributing to a cause they believed in. Hermann Göring's dismissal of American production capacity, his contemptuous reaction to Roosevelt's announcement in May 1940, stands as history's most catastrophic miscalculation. His contempt for democratic industrial potential cost Germany the war and cost millions of people their lives. His failure to recognize American capabilities, rooted in ideological blindness and racial prejudice, sealed the Third Reich's fate before the first American bomber reached German skies. The production war was over before it began because one side understood modern industrial warfare and the other did not. Part 4 of this comprehensive military history documentary examines the broader implications of the production miracle, exploring how this transformation shaped not just the war, but the entire post-war world. The transformation from 3,000 aircraft annually to 100,000 annually demonstrated that free societies, when facing existential threats, could achieve what seemed impossible. American workers didn't just meet Roosevelt's ambitious goal, they doubled it. They didn't just match German production, they exceeded it fivefold while simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and maintaining domestic prosperity. Today's leaders, facing their own challenges and making their own strategic calculations, would do well to remember Göring's mistake. Dismissing democratic nations as weak because they're peaceful during peacetime, or underestimating free people's productive capacity because they prefer prosperity to conquest, invites catastrophic miscalculation. Democracies can appear disorganized and inefficient during peacetime because they tolerate dissent, because they allow inefficiency in pursuit of freedom, because they value individual liberty over collective coordination. But when threatened, democracies can mobilize resources and unite populations in ways that totalitarian states cannot match. America in 1940 appeared unprepared for war, and by conventional measures it was unprepared. Its military was small, its equipment was obsolete, its industrial capacity was oriented toward civilian production. But appearances deceived. America possessed latent capabilities that could be mobilized rapidly. By 1944, it had become an unstoppable industrial colossus, producing war material in quantities that staggered imagination. The arsenal of democracy proved that production lines could be as decisive as front lines, that assembly workers could be as crucial as soldiers, that industrial mobilization could determine victory as surely as military strategy. The female workforce deserves particular recognition for their revolutionary contribution. Women like Rose Monroe, who became famous as Rosie the Riveter, but who represented hundreds of thousands of women working in aircraft plants, fundamentally changed both the war's outcome and American society's structure. These women proved that gender had nothing to do with industrial capability when proper training and equipment were provided. They proved that traditional roles could be set aside during emergencies. They proved that women could perform any industrial job that men could perform, often with equal or superior precision. The social implications extended far beyond the war years. Women who had worked in factories, who had earned independent incomes, who had proved their capabilities, were not willing to simply return to traditional domestic roles when peace came. The seeds of the women's rights movements of the 1960s and 70s were planted in the aircraft factories of the 1940s. Women had proved themselves capable, and that proof could not be erased. The production miracle thus contributed not just to military victory, but to social transformation, helping to create the more egalitarian society that would emerge in post-war America. African American workers faced particular challenges and achieved particular triumphs during this period. Discriminated against in civilian life, subject to Jim Crow laws in southern states and informal discrimination in northern states, African Americans found relatively better treatment in war plants that desperately needed workers. Wages were equal regardless of race in most facilities, a revolutionary departure from normal practice. Working conditions were equal. Promotional opportunities, while not fully equal, were better than in civilian industry. Many African American families achieved middle-class status for the first time through war plant employment. The political implications were significant. African American workers who had contributed to victory, who had built the bombers that defeated fascism, returned home expecting fair treatment and equal rights. When they found continued discrimination, many became active in civil rights movements. The disconnect between wartime rhetoric about freedom and democracy and post-war reality of continued segregation and discrimination became increasingly untenable. The war thus set in motion forces that would eventually lead to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The production miracle contributed to social progress as well as military victory. The economic implications extended decades beyond the war's end. The production infrastructure, built for military manufacturing, became the foundation for post-war prosperity. Aluminum smelters that had produced materials for bomber airframes shifted to producing aluminum for consumer goods, for automobiles, for construction, for thousands of applications. Chemical plants that had made aviation fuel and explosives shifted to producing plastics, synthetic fibers, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers. Machine tool factories that had equipped aircraft plants provided the precision equipment that would power American manufacturing dominance for decades. The organizational techniques developed during wartime proved equally valuable. Statistical quality control, developed to reduce aircraft defect rates, became standard practice across American industry. Project management techniques, developed to coordinate complex aircraft production across hundreds of suppliers, became models for managing large industrial projects. Supply chain management practices, developed to ensure parts arrived precisely when needed, became fundamental to efficient manufacturing. The wartime industrial mobilization thus provided lessons that would shape American business practice for generations. The universities and research institutions that had contributed to military production continued their work in peacetime, often with military funding but applying knowledge broadly. MIT's radiation laboratory, which had developed radar-based navigation systems for bombers, became a center for electronics research that would contribute to the computer revolution. Caltech's aeronautics programs, which had trained aircraft designers, would train the rocket scientists who would put Americans on the moon. The connections between universities, government, and industry, forged during wartime cooperation, would persist and strengthen during the Cold War, creating the military-industrial academic complex that would drive American technological leadership. The financial lessons from wartime mobilization challenged conventional economic wisdom and influenced post-war economic policy. The idea that massive government spending could stimulate employment and production when resources were underutilized became accepted doctrine, though it would be debated and contested. The success of war bond drives showed that government could mobilize private savings for public purposes through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. The dramatic increase in personal income during war years, despite rationing and shortages of consumer goods, demonstrated that full employment could raise living standards even during wartime. The post-war economic boom of the late 1940s and 1950s owed much to wartime mobilization. Workers had accumulated savings during the war because high wages combined with limited consumer goods availability had forced savings. When peace came, these accumulated savings funded a consumer boom. Families bought homes, automobiles, appliances, all the consumer goods they had postponed purchasing during the war. The industries that had built bombers shifted to building commercial aircraft. The factories that had made military vehicles shifted to making automobiles. The chemical plants that had made explosives shifted to making plastics. The conversion was remarkably smooth, creating the prosperity that would define the 1950s. The international implications were equally profound. American production had not only defeated the Axis powers, but had supplied Allied nations through Lend-Lease, the program under which America provided war material to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other Allied nations. Approximately 17% of American war production went to Lend-Lease rather than to American forces. This material contribution established America as the indispensable nation, the country without whose support Allied victory would have been impossible. Soviet forces advanced to Berlin partially on American trucks, eating American rations, communicating on American radios, supplied by American cargo ships. This indispensability translated to post-war influence. America emerged from the war as the only major industrial power whose productive capacity was not only intact, but greatly expanded. Britain had survived, but was exhausted and heavily indebted. The Soviet Union had won, but at catastrophic cost, with much of its western territory devastated. Germany and Japan were defeated and occupied. France had been occupied and damaged. Italy had been a battlefield. China had been ravaged by years of warfare. Only America emerged from the war stronger than it had entered, with productive capacity nearly doubled, with a trained workforce, with technological advantages. This unique position made America the natural leader of the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe, was possible only because America had the production capacity to supply both domestic needs and European reconstruction. The Bretton Woods system, which made the dollar the world's reserve currency, was possible only because America's economy was so dominant. NATO, the military alliance that would contain Soviet expansion, was credible only because America could produce the weapons to equip Allied forces. American hegemony, in the post-war decades, rested fundamentally on the production capacity developed during the war years. The contrast with the Soviet Union is instructive and helps explain the eventual outcome of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had mobilized impressively during World War II, producing vast quantities of tanks and artillery and aircraft. Soviet sacrifice had been immense, with 27 million dead. Soviet military contribution to defeating Germany was crucial, perhaps decisive. But Soviet production methods relied on coercion, on forced labor, on suppression of consumption to maximize military production. This approach could work during wartime emergency, but proved unsustainable during peacetime competition. American production methods, based on voluntary cooperation, on market incentives, on relatively fair wages and working conditions, proved sustainable across decades. American workers produced willingly because they benefited personally from their labor. Soviet workers produced under compulsion because they had no choice. Over time, this difference compounded. American productivity increased continuously as workers gained experience and employers adopted better methods and technology improved. Soviet productivity stagnated as workers lacked incentives and managers followed rigid plans and technology lagged. By the 1980s, the gap had become unbridgeable. America and its allies had economies several times larger than the Soviet bloc. When the Soviet Union tried to compete militarily with America during the Reagan administration's defense buildup, the effort bankrupted them. They could not match American military spending while maintaining even minimal living standards for their population. The Cold War ended with Soviet collapse, and one can trace this outcome directly back to the production war of World War II. America had learned how to mobilize democratic industrial capacity. The Soviet Union relied on coercive methods that worked during emergencies, but failed during extended competition. The technological implications of the production miracle deserve attention as well. The war years saw unprecedented cooperation between scientists, engineers, and industrialists. Academic researchers worked directly with production engineers to solve practical problems. Companies shared proprietary information for the common good. Government funded research and development at unprecedented levels. This wartime cooperation established patterns that would continue and intensify during the Cold War, creating the innovation ecosystem that would maintain American technological leadership for decades. Consider the path from the B-29 Superfortress to the Boeing 747 commercial jetliner. The B-29 was the most advanced aircraft of its era, incorporating pressurization, remote-controlled gun turrets, advanced engines, sophisticated navigation equipment. Boeing engineers who designed the B-29 applied lessons learned to post-war commercial aircraft. The Stratocruiser, Boeing's first post-war commercial aircraft, was essentially a modified B-29. The 707, which revolutionized commercial aviation, incorporated aerodynamic principles developed for military aircraft. The 747, which made mass air travel affordable, used production techniques pioneered at Willow Run. The civilian benefits of military research and development extended across industries. Jet engines developed for military aircraft powered commercial aviation. Radar developed for military use became essential for civilian air traffic control. Computers developed for calculating ballistics trajectories became essential for business and science. Synthetic materials developed for military applications found countless civilian uses. The investment in military production during World War II thus yielded dividends far beyond military victory, establishing America's technological leadership across multiple domains. The story of American production supremacy must also acknowledge the human cost and moral complexity of this achievement. While American workers volunteered and were compensated fairly, the contrast with German slave labor reveals both moral and practical superiority of democratic methods. The Nazi regime, in its final years, relied increasingly on slave labor from concentration camps and occupied territories. These workers, facing starvation and death regardless of their productivity, had every incentive to sabotage production. And they did, systematically and courageously, slowing German production when it was most desperately needed. One Holocaust survivor, Benjamin Ferencz, who would later become a prosecutor at Nuremberg, documented the systematic sabotage by slave laborers in German aircraft factories. Workers would deliberately misalign components so they would fail in use. They would contaminate fuel. They would damage precision instruments. They would provide false quality control reports. This resistance, carried out at tremendous personal risk, materially contributed to Allied victory by reducing the effectiveness and reliability of German equipment. The moral bankruptcy of slavery thus revealed itself as strategic bankruptcy. Systems built on cruelty are inefficient. Systems built on freedom are efficient. The post-war trials at Nuremberg brought additional clarity to the production war's outcome. Industrialists who had employed slave labor were prosecuted for war crimes. The connection between industrial production and military aggression was made explicit. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and the man most responsible for managing German war production, testified extensively about the systematic failure of German industry to match Allied production. His testimony, while self-serving in some respects, provided detailed confirmation of American production superiority from the German perspective. Speer had been considered an organizational genius, the man who had kept German war production functioning despite Allied bombing. But his testimony revealed that he had been managing decline, not achieving growth. German production peaked in 1944 despite Speer's efforts, then collapsed rapidly as the Allied bombing campaign intensified and raw material shortages became critical. Speer's testimony confirmed that American bombing had reduced German production by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, 42% for trucks. These were catastrophic reductions that made continued resistance impossible. More significantly, Speer testified that even without bombing, Germany could never have matched American production. The resource base was too limited, the labor force was too small, the industrial infrastructure was too concentrated, the transportation network was too vulnerable. Even if Germany had been left unmolested, operating at peak efficiency, it still would have been outproduced several times over by American industry. The outcome was determined by fundamental economic realities, not by tactical success or failure of bombing campaigns. Germany was, quite simply, too small and too resource-poor to compete industrially with the United States. This testimony demolished the myth, popular in some post-war German accounts, that Germany lost only because it was outnumbered by the combined Allies. Germany would have lost to American production alone, even without British or Soviet contribution. The mathematical reality was inescapable. America's gross domestic product in 1940 was approximately $800 billion in modern dollars. Germany's was perhaps 300 billion. The gap widened during the war as America's economy grew while Germany's contracted. By 1944, America's economy was roughly 4 times larger than Germany's. This economic gap translated directly into production gap, and production gap translated directly into military outcome. Part 5 of this extensive historical documentary shifts focus to the Pacific Theater, where American production superiority manifested differently but equally decisively. The war against Japan, fought across vast ocean distances with entirely different challenges than the European War, demonstrated the flexibility and scope of American industrial might. Japan, like Germany, had made catastrophic miscalculations about American capability and will. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned his government that attacking America was folly. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve," he reportedly said. Yamamoto had studied in America and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders. But Yamamoto's warnings were ignored by militarists who, like their German counterparts, dismissed American capability. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, pleasure-seeking, individualistic people incapable of the collective sacrifice required for total war. Like the Germans, the Japanese believed their ideology and warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Like the Germans, they were catastrophically wrong. The production war in the Pacific followed the same trajectory as in Europe. Initial Japanese success followed by inexorable American material superiority that made eventual victory certain, regardless of tactical setbacks. The Pacific War's unique characteristic was the centrality of naval power. Control of the vast Pacific Ocean required aircraft carriers, the revolutionary warships that projected air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japan began the war with 10 aircraft carriers, including several of the finest carriers in the world. America had 7 carriers, several relatively old and obsolete. But by the war's end, America had produced more than 100 carriers of various types, while Japan struggled to replace losses and completed only a handful of new carriers. This disparity in carrier construction tells the Pacific production story as clearly as bomber production tells the European story. Consider the Essex-class fleet carriers, the backbone of American carrier forces by 1944. These were large, modern carriers displacing 27,000 tons, capable of operating 90 aircraft, equipped with excellent damage control systems and anti-aircraft defenses. America commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, with more under construction when peace came. 17 large carriers, each a complex warship requiring millions of man-hours to construct, completed in just over 3 years. Japan completed 0 large carriers during the same period, managing only a few smaller carriers and converted civilian ships. The production disparity extended to every category of naval vessel: destroyers, submarines, amphibious ships, support vessels. America outproduced Japan several times over in every category. But perhaps most impressively, America did this while simultaneously building ships for the Atlantic Theater, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with ships through Lend-Lease, and maintaining domestic shipbuilding capacity. American shipyards in 1944 were launching major warships at rates measured in ships per day, not ships per month or year. The scale was simply unprecedented in naval history. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that transported war material across the oceans, epitomized American production capacity. These standardized cargo ships, designed for rapid construction using welding rather than traditional riveting, could be built in 45 days on average. Some shipyards achieved much faster construction, with the record being just under 5 days from keel laying to launch. 5 days to build a 10,000-ton cargo ship. These vessels were not elegant. They were not designed to last decades, but they carried cargo reliably. They could be built faster than German submarines could sink them, and they ensured that material reached its destination. The U-boat war in the Atlantic. Germany's attempt to strangle Britain by sinking cargo ships faster than they could be replaced ultimately failed because American shipyards produced ships faster than submarines could sink them. At the peak of the U-boat campaign in 1942 and early 1943, German submarines were sinking ships at alarming rates. But American production accelerated faster than German sinking rates. By mid-1943, Allied ships were being completed faster than Germany could sink them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not primarily through better tactics or technology, though both mattered, but through production overwhelming attrition. Aircraft production for the Pacific theater posed different challenges than European production. The distances were greater, requiring longer-range aircraft. The climate was harsher, requiring better corrosion protection and tropical adaptations. The logistics were more complex, requiring floating repair facilities and supply systems that could operate thousands of miles from American shores. American industry adapted to these challenges with characteristic flexibility. Aircraft destined for the Pacific received tropical modifications. Long-range variants were developed. Support equipment was designed for shipboard or island deployment. The B-29 Superfortress, mentioned earlier in the context of technological advancement, became the decisive weapon in the Pacific War. This aircraft, with its pressurized cabin allowing high-altitude operation, its 4 powerful engines providing range exceeding 3,000 miles, its capacity to carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, was specifically designed for the Pacific theater. The distances from American bases to Japanese targets demanded such range. The need to destroy Japanese industry demanded such bomb capacity. Only American industry could have developed and produced such an advanced aircraft in meaningful numbers. The B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project, approximately $3 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to more than $50 billion today. This staggering investment produced approximately 4,000 B-29s, each one an engineering marvel. The aircraft featured innovations like remote-controlled gun turrets, advanced fire control systems, sophisticated pressurization systems, powerful engines producing 2,200 horsepower each. No other nation could have afforded to develop such an aircraft, let alone produce thousands of them. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, conducted primarily by B-29s operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, devastated Japanese industrial capacity and urban areas. The scale of destruction exceeded even the European bombing campaign in concentration and intensity. Single raids involved hundreds of bombers, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries on Japanese cities built largely of wood and paper. The firestorms killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed much of Japan's urban infrastructure. This campaign was possible only because of American production capacity, because bombers lost to accidents or combat were immediately replaced, because fuel and bombs arrived in unlimited quantities, because spare parts and maintenance equipment were abundant. The atomic bombs, delivered by B-29s in August 1945, ended the Pacific War before the planned invasion of Japan became necessary. But the bombs themselves, revolutionary though they were, represented only one aspect of American technological and industrial superiority. The Manhattan Project that developed the bombs required massive industrial investment. Uranium enrichment required vast electrical generating capacity and specialized equipment. Plutonium production required nuclear reactors and chemical separation facilities. Weapon design and testing required unprecedented scientific and engineering resources. Only America had the industrial capacity to pursue such a program while simultaneously fighting a global war. The decision to use atomic weapons remains controversial, debated by historians and ethicists. But from a production war perspective, the bombs demonstrated that American industrial and scientific capacity extended to the most complex technologies imaginable. Germany had nuclear research programs, but could never have produced atomic weapons during the war because the industrial investment required was beyond their capacity. Japan never came close because they lacked the scientific foundation and industrial infrastructure. The Soviet Union developed atomic weapons only after the war, with significant help from espionage that provided American and British research. American development of atomic weapons while fighting a global war demonstrated depth of capability that no other nation could match. The war's end in August 1945 came from multiple factors. Soviet entry into the war against Japan, occurring between the two atomic bombings, convinced Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile. The naval blockade had reduced Japan to near-starvation conditions. The bombing campaign had destroyed much of Japanese industry. But underlying all these immediate causes was the fundamental reality that Japan could not match American production. Every month the war continued. America grew stronger while Japan grew weaker. The atomic bombs accelerated the inevitable, but did not fundamentally change the ultimate outcome. Japan had lost the production war just as Germany had, and once that war was lost, military defeat followed inexorably. Part 6 of this comprehensive World War II documentary draws together the themes and examines the lasting legacy of the production miracle. The war's end left America in an unprecedented position of global dominance, possessing not only the world's most powerful military, but also the world's most productive economy. The two were inextricably linked. Military power rested on industrial capacity. Industrial capacity enabled military power. This relationship, demonstrated conclusively during World War II, would shape American strategy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The immediate post-war period saw rapid demobilization of American military forces, but preservation of industrial capacity. Factories that had built bombers could build commercial aircraft. Shipyards that had built warships could build cargo vessels. Chemical plants that had made explosives could make fertilizers and plastics. The productive infrastructure remained intact and available for peacetime purposes. This gave America an enormous advantage in post-war competition, both economic and military. While other nations struggled to rebuild damaged industries, America converted its expanded wartime industries to peacetime production. The GI Bill, which provided education and training benefits to returning servicemen, represented a massive investment in human capital that would pay dividends for decades. Veterans who had operated complex military equipment, who had managed logistics, who had led troops, returned to civilian life with valuable skills. Many used GI Bill benefits to attend university, creating a surge in college education that would transform American society. The engineers and scientists and managers who would lead American technology companies for the next several decades often received their education through the GI Bill, funded by wartime victory. The Cold War, beginning almost immediately after World War II ended, became essentially a continuation of the production war under different circumstances. The Soviet Union, having seen American production capacity firsthand through Lend-Lease shipments, understood that matching American military capacity required matching American industrial capacity. The Soviet leadership attempted to do this through forced pace industrialization, through emphasis on heavy industry and military production at the expense of consumer goods, through coercion rather than voluntary cooperation. For a time, particularly during the 1950s, this approach appeared to work. Soviet industrial production grew rapidly. Soviet military forces were formidable. Soviet technology achieved impressive results, particularly in rocketry and space exploration. But the underlying structural problems that had plagued German war production plagued Soviet peacetime production as well. Coercive systems are inefficient. Workers who lack incentives produce less than workers who benefit from their labor. Centrally planned economies cannot adapt as quickly as market economies. Innovation suffers when dissent is suppressed. Over time, these inefficiencies compound. By the 1980s, the gap between American and Soviet productivity had become so large that the Soviet Union could not compete militarily without impoverishing its population even further than they were already impoverished. President Ronald Reagan's defense buildup in the 1980s, particularly the Strategic Defense Initiative, that threatened to extend military competition into space-based systems, forced the Soviet Union to attempt matching American military spending. They could not do so without destroying their economy. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and recognized the unsustainability of Soviet economic policy, he attempted reforms that instead accelerated collapse. By 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved, ending the Cold War with American victory. This victory, like the World War II victory, was fundamentally a production victory. America outproduced the Soviet Union across decades, and the accumulated advantage became insurmountable. The lessons from the World War II production miracle remain relevant for contemporary strategic thinking. Modern military power still rests on industrial and technological foundations. Precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, advanced sensors, sophisticated communication systems all require robust industrial capacity to produce in meaningful quantities. A military that cannot replace losses, that cannot sustain operations through continuous supply of munitions and fuel and spare parts, will lose regardless of the quality of its equipment or the skill of its forces. The production war principles remain valid even as technology has advanced. Recent conflicts have demonstrated this principle repeatedly. The First Gulf War in 1991 saw American-led coalition forces overwhelm Iraqi forces through combination of technological superiority and unlimited supply. Iraqi forces, using largely Soviet-supplied equipment, could not replace losses or sustain operations against an enemy that could bring unlimited material to bear. The precision weapons that dominated news coverage represented American technological advantage, but the ability to use thousands of such weapons, to sustain air operations for weeks, to supply ground forces continuously, rested on production and logistics that traced directly back to World War II lessons. The current geopolitical competition with China presents new challenges that echo World War II patterns in troubling ways. China has achieved remarkable industrial growth over recent decades and now rivals or exceeds American industrial capacity in many sectors. Chinese shipyards build more naval vessels than American shipyards. Chinese factories produce more steel, more aluminum, more rare earth materials. Chinese manufacturing capacity exceeds American capacity in numerous categories. This represents a fundamental shift from the unquestioned American industrial superiority that characterized the post-war decades. Whether America can maintain military superiority without corresponding industrial superiority remains an open question. History suggests that sustained military advantage requires industrial foundation. Technology matters enormously, and American technology retains significant advantages in many domains. But technology without the industrial capacity to produce it in quantity may prove insufficient, just as German technological advantages in jet aircraft proved insufficient against overwhelming American production of conventional fighters. The lesson from Hermann Göring's miscalculation applies today. Do not assume technological superiority can compensate for industrial inferiority in sustained competition. The social and political lessons from the World War II production miracle deserve emphasis as we conclude this documentary. Democratic systems, for all their apparent inefficiency and disorder during peacetime, possess latent mobilization capacity that totalitarian systems cannot match. Free peoples, when facing genuine threats, can unite and sacrifice voluntarily in ways that exceed what can be achieved through coercion. Diverse societies, drawing on varied talents and perspectives, can innovate and adapt faster than homogeneous societies. Market economies, with profit incentives and price signals, can organize complex production more efficiently than centrally planned economies. These advantages are not automatic. They require leadership that can articulate threats clearly and inspire collective action. They require institutions that can channel voluntary effort effectively. They require social cohesion sufficient to overcome partisan divisions during emergencies. They require cultural values that emphasize contribution to common good alongside individual liberty. America in 1940 possessed these attributes. Whether contemporary America retains them remains uncertain and will likely be tested. The women who riveted bombers at Willow Run, the engineers who designed production systems, the managers who coordinated suppliers, the workers who built engines and instruments and thousands of components, the pilots who flew the aircraft, the soldiers who benefited from material superiority, all contributed to the production miracle. But the ultimate credit belongs to the democratic system that mobilized their efforts voluntarily and effectively. The arsenal of democracy proved that free peoples defending their values could outproduce, outfight, and outlast tyranny. Hermann Göring learned this lesson too late, at the cost of his nation's destruction. From his dismissive reaction to Roosevelt's announcement in May 1940 to his execution at Nuremberg in October 1946, Göring's journey traced the arc of Nazi Germany's collapse. His contempt for American production became the epitaph for the Third Reich, a regime that confused ideology with capability, that mistook tyranny for strength, that believed racial mythology could overcome industrial mathematics. The Reich Marshal who dismissed American aircraft production died knowing that American factories had produced more planes in 1944 alone than Germany managed throughout the entire war. His mockery of democratic industrial capacity became history's most expensive joke, paid for in the currency of total defeat. Germany produced 94,677 aircraft throughout the war. America produced 295,959. But the real victory lay not in numbers, but in method and meaning. Free workers outproduced slaves. Democratic cooperation exceeded totalitarian command. A nation of immigrants and diverse citizens united to achieve the impossible. The B-24 bombers rolling off Willow Run's assembly line every 63 minutes weren't just aircraft. They were democracy's answer to tyranny. Each rivet driven by a woman who had been a housewife months earlier, each engine built by a teenager who had left high school to serve, each wing assembled by workers who had fled poverty and discrimination, all proved that free peoples, when united in righteous cause, could bury tyranny under an avalanche of production. Hermann Göring laughed at the idea of America producing 50,000 planes annually. America responded by producing twice that many, while simultaneously transforming global history. His laughter echoed through history as the sound of catastrophic miscalculation, the fatal dismissal of democracy's arsenal by a man who understood neither democracy nor production. In the end, both buried him and everything he represented under 300,000 aircraft, 1 million tanks, tens of thousands of ships, unlimited ammunition and supplies, and the unshakable will of free peoples defending their civilization. The production miracle of World War II stands as testament to democracy's strength, to industrial capitalism's productivity, to free labor's superiority over slave labor, to voluntary cooperation's advantage over forced obedience. These lessons remain relevant as we face contemporary challenges. Underestimating democratic capacity invites catastrophe. Dismissing free peoples as weak because they prefer peace invites miscalculation. Assuming that authoritarian systems can outproduce democratic systems over sustained periods contradicts historical evidence. The workers at Willow Run, at Boeing's Seattle plants, at Douglas in Long Beach, at Consolidated in San Diego, at North American in Los Angeles, at thousands of supplier factories across America, won World War II as surely as the soldiers who fought on battlefields. They demonstrated that industrial production could be decisive in modern warfare, that assembly lines could determine history's course, that the home front could be as crucial as the fighting front. Their legacy extends far beyond military victory to encompass post-war prosperity, technological leadership, and validation of democratic values. This is their story, the untold story of how American factories became the decisive weapon of the Second World War, and how Hermann Göring's contemptuous dismissal of democratic capability became the symbol of history's most catastrophic miscalculation.